Photoshop for the web is here, and in this video I'm going to show you what it's all about. It's only a beta release, but it's very powerful. I'm going to use a project-based approach so that you can see how it works. You're going to learn how to create selections, change the color of an object, composite in other images by creating layer masks, and apply text to your images. I really think that you're going to enjoy this online editor. Again, this is a beta release. It's not a full release. There's some things missing, but I think Adobe is headed in the right direction. Let me know in the comments what you think. Let's jump right into the tutorial. Start by going into photoshop.adobe.com/new. This will open up Photoshop Beta. And from here, you can create a new document and use one of the presets that you see on these tabs, or you can go into the hamburger menu and open up a document. In this case, I'm going to create a document that is 1920 by 1280, and I'll set the background to transparent, and I'll click on Create. Photoshop will create my new document. Here's a useful keyboard shortcut. You can press Ctrl-0 on Windows, Command-0 on the Mac to fit the image to screen. This is the view that I like to work with. You can also click on this drop-down and select Fit to Screen. You can see the keyboard shortcut here. Also, notice that on the right-hand side, we have the Layers panel enabled. There's also the Properties panel, the Comments panel, which you can use to send your Photoshop document to a collaborator so they can give you feedback on what you're working on, and an info panel that has information about the document. For this tutorial, we're mainly going to work in the Properties panel. A side note, the Property panel also has the Appearance tab that contains the blend mode options and the opacity in the regular version of Photoshop that is found in the Layers panel. On the left-hand side, you'll notice the toolbar and the color chips that you can use to set your foreground and background color. Let's bring in our first image. You can bring an image into Photoshop Web by clicking on this icon, that is the Place tool. This will open up this window, and from here you can select any file that you have in your Creative Cloud documents or files on your computer. I'm going to click on your computer, and that will bring up this window. And from here, I'll select this image of a couch and I'll press on Open. Photoshop will import that in, and you'll see the transformation tool here. So I can click and drag these transformation handles to fit my image to screen, like so. If need be, I can use these icons to flip my image horizontally or vertically. In this case, I don't need to do this, so I'll simply click on Done. From the toolbar, I can always select the Move tool and click and drag the layer if need be. Also, at any point, I can click on the Transformation tool and continue transforming this layer. So I'm just going to move this over to the left just a tiny bit and drag it up even more. But I could also distort it by clicking and dragging on the handles. And I can always zoom out so that I can see all the transformation handles. You can click on Done to commit the changes. Again, I'll press Ctrl-0, Command-0 on the Mac to fit my image to screen. Photoshop for the web has very useful adjustment layers. You can click on this icon to see the adjustment layers. Not all the adjustment layers are here, but you do have useful ones like the hue and saturation adjustment layer, the black and white adjustment layer, and levels. Let's start with hue and saturation. But before we do that, I want to also show you how to make a selection inside of Photoshop for the web. We have the selection tools under this icon. Notice that when I enable a tool, the option bar changes and you can see the options here. In this case, I'm going to use the Select Subject feature, which utilizes Adobe Sensei artificial intelligence to analyze your image and automatically make a selection out of your main subject. I'm going to click on that. And now you'll see the marching ants going around the couch. What I'll do now is go into this icon and create a hue and saturation adjustment layer, which will create a layer mask out of that selection so that this adjustment layer only affects the couch. Notice now that in the Properties panel, I can drag this hue slider to change the color of the couch and maybe decrease the saturation just a bit. Notice that this adjustment is also affecting the pillows. If you want to remove that from the selection, you can always paint with black on the layer mask or use one of the selection tools to make a selection and fill with black. In this case, we're going to use the quick selection tool to click and drag and select the pillows and the blanket. Also, as I'm making the selection, notice that down here we have useful tools like the deselect option. So I'll deselect there and make sure that you sample all layers so that I can sample the layers below and that I select the pillows and nothing else. So I'm selecting the pillows. I'm getting a little bit of the couch, but that's okay. You can always hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click and drag to subtract from the selection. I'm not going to create a perfect selection. It's not necessary for this tutorial, but you can see that the selection tool is very accurate. I'm missing a little bit of the pillow here that I'm just going to click and drag to add to this pillow. Now that I have the selection active, I can go into the layer mask for the hue and saturation adjustment layer and fill with black. You can use the bucket tool, which is this tool right here, and click once to fill with black. But better yet, I like using the keyboard shortcut, so I'll press Alt and backspace. That's Option Delete on the Mac, and you can also fill with the foreground color, which is black in this case. You can see the two chips here. You can click on the chip to enable the foreground color picker and then change the color if you want. And the reason that I'm getting gray and not red is because I have the layer mask selected. If I select the layer, when I go into the chip, it will become red, as you can see. And you can click on this icon to swap the foreground and background color. Again, with the selection active, you can click on this icon to deselect, and I can now go into the brush tool. And from here, I can select my brush size and my brush hardness, and also the type of brush that I'll be using. In this case, a soft round brush will work. I'll make sure that I'm on the layer mask, so I'll click on that to get this blue focus on the layer mask, and I'll paint with white so that I can reveal the effect on these areas here. Notice how I'm fine-tuning that layer mask. What I'm going to do now is bring in another image so that we can composite it into the couch. You can bring in another image in Photoshop for the web by clicking on the Place Image tool here in the toolbar. Then you can click on the On My Computer button. I'll select the dog and I'll press on Open. This will bring in this photo of a dog, and I can make it a little smaller and maybe drag him up right about here, and I'll click on Done. What I'll do now is go back into the selection options, and I'll use the Remove Background action. This will automatically select the dog and create a layer mask to remove the background. I'm going to go into the Transformation tool and maybe make him just a bit smaller and drag him up and place him right about here. And I'll click on Done. What I'll do now is go into the New Adjustment Layer icon and select Levels. I want this adjustment layer to only affect the dog. In order for me to do that, I need to create a clipping mask. So I'll click on this icon here to create a clipping mask. And now any adjustment that I make will only affect the dog. So I'm just going to click and drag the center point to the right to give it more contrast, and this white point to the left so that the image is not so bright. That way everything looks more cohesive and the foreground matches the background a little better. Another thing that you can do with Photoshop for the web is, of course, create blank layers. So I'm going to click on this layer here, the couch layer, create a brand new blank layer. You can rename a layer by double clicking on it. And I'm just going to call it Heal because I'm going to use the healing brush tool now, the spot healing brush tool, to make adjustments. I also have the healing brush and the clone stamp tool, but I'm going to focus just on this brush, and I'm going to enable sample all layers. But I'm also going to click on the eye icon for these layers so that I'm only looking at the original image. So with the heal layer active, I can click and drag to remove the buttons. I don't really want any buttons on my image, so I'm using this tool to remove these distractions. Of course, you can use the same tool to remove blemishes and other distractions on your images. So you can see the before and the after. And when I enable the rest of the layers by clicking on these eye icons, you can see the result before and after again. Just like with any other version of Photoshop, you have the crop tool, and the crop tool works just like it would in Photoshop. You can use these transformation handles to adjust the crop of your image any way that you want. Of course, when you're done, you can always click on the Done button. In this case, it looks like I added some space to the bottom of my image, but that's okay. I can just press Control Z on Windows, Command Z on the Mac to undo, or I could have clicked on this icon here to undo. Next, let's look at the type tool. I'm going to click on that and then click over the image, and I'm simply going to type the word couch. From this dropdown, I can select the font to use for this couch. In this case, I'm going to go with the stencil font. Notice that didn't change. Well, that's because I didn't have the text highlighted, but once I highlight the text and select the right font, it'll apply it into my image. Of course, I could apply any of these other properties. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as is with the color set to black as opposed to any other color. I'll click on done. And now I can use a transformation tool to adjust the size of my font. And I could also click and drag on this icon here to rotate it a bit. And I can place it right about here. I'll press done to commit the changes. Next, I'm going to add a little shadow to the dog to make this composite more realistic. So I can create a new layer underneath the dog layer. So I'll click on this icon and I'll double click on it to call it shadow. But in this case, I actually want the shadow below the hue and saturation. And I'm going to paint with red. So I'll select the eyedropper tool and select the red that you see on here. Then I'll paint with the brush tool using a soft brush. And I can paint the shadow in, but I need to make sure that I'm on the actual shadow layer. And I can paint like so. If you have a tablet, you can use the pressure for size and for opacity. In this case, I'm just painting with the regular mouse. So I'm painting on the dog like so. If you make a mistake, you can use the eraser tool and use it to erase. You can also use the bracket keys on the keyboard to adjust your brush size just like you can with the regular version of Photoshop. And of course, you can adjust the size and hardness from these sliders and continue making any adjustments that you want. For this shadow to look a little more realistic, we do need to change the blending mode to something else. So I'm going to go into the properties panel and under appearance, I'll select multiply. And you can see that the shadow looks much better. And when I enable the hue and saturation adjustment layer, the shadow looks green as well. There's a few more things that I want to show you here on Photoshop for the web. I'm going to go back into the original couch, right click, and select duplicate layer. So now I have a duplicate copy of my original couch layer. And if you notice, there's some depth of field here on this photo of the dog. It's a little blurry, but then the couch becomes sharp. That wouldn't happen in the real world. I do need to match the depth of field, and I can do so by blurring the layer. So with this couch copy active, I'm gonna go into this menu and you'll see the filters. There's only two filters. Some people think there's no filters in Photoshop for the web, but there is in fact two filters, Gaussian blur and invert. So I'm going to click on Gaussian blur so that I can blur the layer just a bit so you can see the layer blurring. Obviously I don't want to blur it too much. So I'm going to just bring it back down to right about here where we're barely getting some of that blur, and I'll click on done. But I don't want the entire layer to be blurry. I only want parts of my layer to be blurry. So with this layer active, I'll click on the layer mask icon to make a layer mask. And I want to hide the contents of the entire layer mask. So I'm going to go to the hamburger menu, go into filter and select invert, and that'll hide the contents of that layer. And now when I paint with white, on that layer mask, I'll selectively bring in some of the blurriness so that the blurriness now matches the composite. And obviously in a real project, you can spend all that time that you need to get the results that you want. And I only use this method because I wanted to selectively blur the background. When you're done with your image, you can always open it up inside of Photoshop Desktop, or you can share it with anyone by clicking on this icon and selecting Quick Export, Share Document. So that again, you can send this file to anyone so they can leave you comments. They don't need to have Photoshop. All they need is an Adobe ID. And as I mentioned before, you can open it up in the desktop app. Clicking in the blue share icon will also allow you to create a link so that you can invite people to access the image. And something very important that I want to tell you is that if you click on this question mark icon, you can also see the keyboard shortcuts that are found in Photoshop for the web. Here they all are so that you can memorize them if you like. And also when you go back into the hamburger menu, you can click on the settings icon. And from here, you'll see the settings for Photoshop for the web. It's available in several languages, as you can see. And by the way, let me know what you think about Photoshop for the web down below in the comments. Click on that like button now if you learned something new. Hitting that like button really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. So I would really appreciate it if you clicked on it. I think that Photoshop for the web is off to a great start. Not bad for a beta release, but it's clearly not there. I'm really looking forward to seeing where Adobe takes it. It's actually very similar to Photoshop on the iPad. It was released with not a lot of features, but Adobe has been adding more features as time goes on, and I think the same thing will happen with Photoshop for the web. Talking about Photoshop for the iPad, make sure that you check out my free course on Photoshop for the iPad. You can check it out here. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Jesus Ramirez, and I'll talk to you again in the next Photoshop tutorial.